As your network automation practice evolves, so should your tools. Don't manage your collections of Ansible playbooks and Python scripts artisanally. Move up to Itential and load your automations onto a scalable platform your whole team can use. Visit itential.com to find out more. That's itential.com. Welcome to Heavy Networking, your weekly trip down the rabbit hole into the wonderland of packets. I'm Ethan Banks, your co-host since 2010, and with me is co-host Drew Conray Murray, the man with the Hollywood hair and a fantastic smile. You can chat with us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, or the 100% free Packet Pushers Community Slack group, and please do. Now, if you're in that Slack group, our guest needs no introduction. Frank Seesink has been one of the community's most active members, always willing to share his knowledge and opinions about networking with anyone who needs some help. And I got to meet Frank in person last month as we converged on the Internet 2 meeting in Boston and shared a meal. And from there, we managed to convince Frank to get behind a mic and record an episode with us. So thanks for coming on board, Frank. And we did kick around a lot of topics, but I think most of our focus today is going to be on getting networking done with little to no budget. This is something Frank and I found that we've both had to deal with in our careers. And we know a lot of you out there are in the same situation. You got no budget, make miracles happen, go. So, all right, we're going to talk about that. So, Frank, welcome to Heavy Networking. And I don't think it's your very first time on Packet Pushers. I think you've had your voice on here before, but maybe introduce yourself.
I have been on once with Greg Farrow. That was a few years ago. So anyway, my name is Frank Seesink. The short version is I'm originally from the Netherlands. My parents immigrated to the States when I was a kid. I grew up here in the Eastern Seaboard. My background is predominantly in computer science. My career I've got way too much stuff that I could talk about, but I have been doing networking for probably, oh gosh, well over 30 years now. My earliest actual network that I built would have been a thin net network for a international shipping company. But I have so much. I took notes to kind of keep myself on par, but I could talk about almost anything. So today, to fast forward, I spent 20 years working for an R&E a state R&E network. And then currently I'm working for a large American university where basically my formal title is senior network engineer. I'm also part of the DevOps group. I do everything from your traditional day-to-day stuff, VLAN configurations, MLAGs, to handling tickets. I also manage the VPN. And when we're going into new areas, I typically go digging into stuff. So, but like I say, I've got way more notes than we have time for.
You said thin net, so I got to ask you, do you still have 50 ohm terminators in a drawer somewhere?
Yeah, I think I do. I actually have, and I have some of the T connectors as well.
Yeah.
I actually ran that stuff through a wall. These are early days back when Novell Networks was still a big thing.
Oh, yeah.
And you probably ran into this too. It's like if people ran networks back then, they would run the cable down through a drywall, pop it out through an opening, put it on a T connector, run it back into the wall and back up. But these were back when all the PCs were big towers. And the most common problem was you're in an office with 50, 100 people, and suddenly the network's down. And you had to go walking around tracing the entire path of this cable to find the person who had pushed their PC back against the wall a little too hard and crimped that connector and took out the whole network. Those were fun days.
So traceroute was originally a sneaker protocol. Is that what you're telling
Oh,
me?
absolutely. I will
That's
tell you,
true.
I don't miss hubs, and I don't miss, dealing with that sort of stuff. So, because that hubs alone were a huge improvement, but the thin net, my goodness.
No,
And this was
my thin net crimping story, Frank, is similar. It was in a print shop environment, and a lot of it wasn't an office structure. There were like huge machines and so on, taking up floor space, and we would just run the thin net along the edge of the wall and through the wall no, there's a door there. We can just run it like under the door, and then it gets stuck in the door jam because someone would open close the door. It's like open the door, you crimp the cable, that kind of stuff. Ah, the good old days, Frank, the good old days. Yeah. And you said netware. So did you do your time in the Novell trenches too?
I did. I did. Not to the level that some folks did. I mean, I do, good Lord. This it scares me that I still remember like the 3Com 3C509s,
Oh yeah.
having to compile the drivers for each specific NIC and model. Oh gosh. I don't miss those days. I really don't miss those days. Um,
Oh, That I think I had a password that involved 3C509 at one point in time, way back in the day, because you
I mean,
need
if I want to
characters
date
and stuff.
myself, there's a lot of folks who are probably listening to this who aren't old enough to remember this, but I actually used, now I was in college, but I actually used a 300 baud acoustic coupler modem. They had one in our dorm in the
That
quote
is, you take
unquote
the handset
the
and you put it
handset.
in the cradle
Yep, in the
and let the
cushions.
noises. Yeah.
Yep.
Ah,
You literally, it was what they called the computer lab in our dorm was literally a closet with a fold out table with a DEC VT220 terminal sitting on it, and then an acoustic coupler and a Bell Labs. I mean, because we're still talking back in the AT&T days almost. Actually, it wasn't. It was just past that. But it was like, yeah, you had to know what the phone number was. You had to pick up the handset, dial the number, wait till you started hearing the wonderful, original modem sounds, push it down into that cushion, and then sit there for a few seconds. And you had to time it right and hit the return key to try to get a reaction. And then once you were good, you're like, okay, I'm at 300 baud. And my freshman year in college, I was like, there's no way in the world I'm doing my work in this. I was originally studying aerospace engineering. And so my very first computer in college, one of the first things I had was a 1200 baud modem. And we had telephones on the wall in our dorm rooms. And so I went to Radio Shack and I found a splitter like the first week of school. And I basically rigged up my room so that anytime I wanted to do my work, I could take my computer, which I had bought a table for that rolled into my closet, put it up against the wall, hook it up to the modem or hook it up to the phone line. And I'll be like, tell my roommate, like, you're not making any phone calls. I got to get some work done. Um,
so it sounds like your history has kind of been maybe not, networking on the cheap, but finding solutions to sort of the barriers that are getting in the way of things you need to do. So how did you is that what led you to sort of getting into networking on a budget? Do you sort of like doing this kind of thing or?
okay. So if I had to sum up what I like solving problems. That's the
Hmm.
big one, right?
Yep.
And I like communications in as a whole. For me, when I look back on my life, everything was about getting people to communicate with each other in some form. Now, computer networking, obviously, we do that a lot. We do a lot between machines too. But um, because of my background, I'll sum it up this way: being that my father lived through World War II in the Netherlands, my mom was born in it. That informed a great part of my life. So
Mm.
growing up, my parents didn't have much, and so they instilled a lot in us. So we don't waste. I'm wired not to waste money. So I'm not cheap. I know the Dutch treat. There was a lot of, but the thing is, we're not.
But you
It's not
have
that
the
we're
kitchen
cheap.
drawer full of bread ties, probably.
We have things like the old T-shirt that we don't throw away because you can always wipe the oil off your dipstick with that. I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
it's got a purpose.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
so there's no wasting. But anyway, growing up, I grew up through the PC revolution is how I usually sum it up for folks. So I remember before there was any kind of network connectivity when modems finally came along, my dad at one point had a CompuServe account. And then when I was actually working in his shipping company as a college student in the summers, it turned out, and I found this out years later, I was like, oh, they use Prime computers, which I'd never heard of before. And end result is a lot of people don't know this, but that's exactly what CompuServe was built on. They were built on Prime computers because I was under the hood in the CLI learning how to use these bizarre scripting languages. It was nothing like the Linux and the Unix world where
So
you
so
were.
Prime was a brand or Prime was an OS
Prime was a
or
brand. It's PR, the number one ME, Prime Computers. They were an
huh?
offshoot of, it was not an offshoot, but it was sort of like in the same period as the mini computers when you had DEC, right? Digital Equipment Corporation, the big dog.
Hmm.
But they were one of the companies that made mini computers. And it was
Hmm.
what they used at my dad's office. And at one point while I was playing on there, I'd learned all this stuff. And then a year or two later, I happened to be at home on my dad's computer. And he's like, oh, yeah, I was like, got into CompuServe. I'm like, this is such a cryptic setup. CompuServe was not the easiest thing to work with. But at one point, I ended up at a CLI and I was like, oh, I know where I am. I was like, this looks familiar. It's like when you first learn Unix and you get onto a shell and you're like, I know what I'm doing now. Um, but anyway, the whole thing is that communicating in some form. So for me, email was of course amazing. Texting on mini computers when I was in college, we used VAX VMS systems, and we found out how to communicate with each other through that. Years later, when my younger sister went to college, she was studying graphic design, and they had to buy Macs, and Penn State, where she went, had dorms that had internet connectivity by then. And so I was like, well, she's the baby in the family. And I knew that it was going to be rough on my folks, specifically my mom. They were very close. And so I was like, well, we can set it up that you guys can communicate all the time via email. I mean, my sister would be in the dorm on her Mac and she could send emails to my mom via CompuServe, and vice versa. And it's by that point, SMTP, which is the one universal we've got for really communicating on the internet, because everything else is walled gardens, that basically made it possible. And so between that, my grandfather, my mother's father, he was a POW in World War II, not because we were Jewish, because we're not, but the Dutch male adults who would not serve the Nazi Germany basically were carted off to prisoner war camps.
Mm.
And so in the late 90s, I actually was telling my mom, hey, instead of sending letters that take weeks, it's growing up as a kid, I'm familiar with, you write this letter on this super thin paper so that you can get as many pieces into an envelope so it's under an ounce, and send it. And it was on those blue and red striped envelopes. There's, international
Yeah.
mailing
For
envelopes.
airmail, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But you would send a letter and then you might get an answer about a month later, because it took a week or two just to get there. They had to read it, they had to write a reply, and then they had to send one back. And that was really, not great. And then phones were awesome, but they were super expensive for international calls. So when the internet came along, one of the first things I did was, my younger sister with the email, and then somewhere in that same time frame, AOL Instant Messenger became a pretty big thing, and jumped outside of AOL itself, and you could download that AOL Instant Messenger for Windows. And so I figured out, I was like, hey, if we can get my grandfather on the internet, I can have my mom and my grandfather be able to chat with each other. And so they started doing that in late 90s. I forget exactly. It's been so long now. It's been quite a while. But for me, that's been sort of, I look back and I realized, yeah, I did that. And then in the early 2000s, I figured out how to set up VoIP long before most people knew what it was. And so I had it that my wife and my mother-in-law, when I got married, my wife's originally from Brazil. And so, yeah, the first several years of my life were, how can I lower the cost of these international phone calls? Because we're talking, it was over $1 a minute if you just paid normal rates. So I would
Right.
get one of these international calling plans, which would drop it to 18 cents a minute, which sounds great compared to $1, but you talk for half an hour, that thing, that really adds up quick. And if you're a grad student, and you're not making a lot of money, uh, so I basically at one point, a company called Sipphone came out, and they were one of the very first ones to offer an analog, what now we would just call an analog adapter. Box you put on a local network in your house. You have Ethernet cable on one side, RJ11 on the other. You plug a telephone into the RJ11, and then it makes a SIP call. But they were the provider, so you bought a box from them for like $80. So I bought two of these boxes, deployed one in my house, one down in Brazil the next time we visited my mother-in-law. And then I explained to the two of them, I said, okay, I said, from now on, this phone that's plugged into this special box over here, and I ended up just calling it the bat phone, because it was like the only time it rang, it was my mother-in-law. And down in Brazil, if it rang, she knew it was my wife. And I said, but here's the key thing. I said, you know how in the past you guys would sit there and you would trade calls? My wife would call Brazil, then my mother-in-law would call her. And I know what I was paying on my long distance charges on my side. So I did the math. I mean, we averaged $90 just for the long distance calls per month. And so that's $180 a month just to be able to talk with that constant fear of, oh my gosh, am I on the phone too long? And I said, here's what I've just done. I said, from now on, when you want to talk to each other, you pick up that phone, you dial this number, and you talk to each other. And I said, you know that little sound in the back of your head that's going cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching? I said, it's gone. Talk as long as you want. Talk all day long. And actually, from then till now, for at least the last 20 years now, they call each other every day.
Wow.
So for me, when I say communication, this is a prime example. So, and everything I do is sort of in that realm.
Do you feel like, given the richness, the pervasiveness of communication methods we have now and their relative cheapness, do you feel like there are still barriers or problems for you to work around to facilitate communications these days?
Yes. Okay, less so, but only because of where I am now. So for 20 years, the state I was in, where I worked for an R&E network, it's one of the poorest states in the country. There was never money to do stuff, right?
Mhm.
Now I've moved, I'm 2 states away, and it's a state with much more tech in it, right? I'm in North Carolina at this point, and the Research Triangle Park area is massive. You got
Yeah,
Cisco, IBM, Apple's committed supposedly to spending $1 billion to build a sort of an East Coast place here.
bunch of public cloud providers there.
Oh yeah, tons of stuff. So it feels like night and day from where I came from. it's like a cornucopia of options here. Whereas, my running joke at my last job was always I could do anything I wanted as long as it didn't cost actual dollars. So you get real good about, I got to spin up a VM. Technically, there's cost in there, but, I can hide that in the sense that, we're running VMware and, it's spinning up an extra VM with a couple of gig of memory and a couple of cores is not a big deal. But I was able to achieve a lot with very little because I had to. Here, I can do a lot more. We're not in the same sort of constrained space, but are there places? There's absolutely places. I know that I am like, unlike people that live in Silicon Valley and some of the high tech areas, they take for granted what they have. I know from where I lived before. I know, for example, where I lived before, we were still offering dial-up service until the mid 2010s. We
Wow.
didn't sunset our modem chassis, our last two, till I forget the years, 2014, 2015, but we still had a few people calling in because they lived in places that offered nothing else. I can't fathom what their lives were like because you couldn't even run an update on Windows on a dial-up session. I mean, by the time you tried to download something, it was time for another one. I mean, it just took that long. And now I can't even fathom. Like I just was doing an update the other day, and I'm like, holy crap, that's 12 gig of files I got to pull down. I mean, on a dial-up session, that's impossible. And now we're here in the United States, so we're very fortunate. I mean, for all our problems, we still are quite fortunate. And if you're in Western Europe, but there are definitely places in the world that there's still a lot of challenges. And I don't think that goes away. It's just different. It's just levels.
Mhm.
Yeah, I still focus on that mostly because also, I mean, even here, the pandemic, I'll give an example for that. I'm in one of the best places in this state, supposedly. When we moved here, everybody talked about how the school district we live in is the best one in the whole state. I mean, no one could stop talking about that. So that's why we tried to buy a home here because we're like, we love our child too, and we want him to have a good education. But even so, when I see what they did during the pandemic, if this is what the best school was able to do,
Mhm.
then I know if that's the top of the bar, then I also
Right.
know what's below that. It's like, and there were still a lot of challenges. When I look back to where I used to live, they had nothing like this. I mean, here the school district was able to, through federal grants and other means, be able to hand out mobile hotspots, for example. So for a couple of years, parents of in families that were financially challenged, they had options. But I know that where I came from, there was nothing like that. So I can't imagine the struggles that people have gone through. And it's like, yeah, so I'm always looking for how can we fix this for less and try to make it, financially or fiscally responsible. So, but yeah, I mean, communication in any form is really, that's been my bag, I guess. Between that and like you say, I do like helping folks. So when people ask questions on Slack and other places, I've had I have a few friends from college who, when I stayed where I was and I was working there, that was also the town where I went to my university. They would come back and they would refer to me as professor, even though I didn't work for the university there. I wasn't part of it. I was part of an R&E network, but they were like, why are you still here? And it's like, because I like what I do. And I'm trying to do a good thing.
Mhm.
So, and that's kind of still my driving force.
And now a brief sponsor message from iTential. If you're like me, your network automation skill set is an evolving one. You've probably done some Ansible and Python work and you've had some quick wins, but now you're getting to that point where you want other people in your team to use the automations that you've built. They're sort of okay with Ansible, right? They're definitely not 100%, but they're okay. However, they do not want to figure out Python, and they can't even manage the library dependencies. Most of the folks on your team, what do they want? They want you to give them a thing that they can run and it just works. And if it doesn't, any network task requiring automation comes back to your queue. I call this the platform problem. You need a platform that the whole team can use to run automations without them having to know anything about maintaining a Python environment or even how to run an Ansible playbook. And this is the service iTential provides across their product portfolio. You've created a bunch of network automations. All right, now move them from your laptop into a repository and then let iTential execute them in a scalable, secure way that abstracts details from people that don't need to know while giving access to every nuance for those people that do need to know, people like you. iTential puts you on the road to self-service network automation, allowing anyone you like to run your automation, all while integrating with all the other systems that your organization runs. And to me, this is the ultimate destination for network automation systems, self-service. To find out more about Itential's products and how they help you build an automation platform, visit itential.com. You can test drive Itential free for 30 days. That is itential.com.
Yeah, my budget days were working for state government, I live in New Hampshire, and many, many years ago, I worked for state government. And the challenge was nothing was funded unless a federal grant came through that would facilitate a project. And so, unless that was the scenario, we'd have to just make do with what we had. We had our boxes and bins of parts to keep PCs up and going, and a stash of 3C509s, as the case may be, to keep everybody plugged in, and just the ability to swap things out, make things work, figure out what the problem was. Oh, you know what? So and so's got that card that you actually need in their machine, and they're not using it anymore. I'm going to go pull it out of that and put it in your machine, and so on and so on. That's just you just end up thinking in a certain way that you know where everything is, you know what you've got, you know how to mix and match parts, and you can just make stuff go. Because if you go to your boss and say, "Hey, we need $10,000," I was laughed at times, and then I kind of realized what was going on. They're like, "No, no, this isn't how this works. We don't have money."
10,000 would be way out of range. I mean, it was like your comment about that you could only do things when you had a grant, or you. It's also the only other time was when a vendor, so for example, in the state I used to be in, at the time, Verizon got caught with their hand in the cookie jar, is the way I always describe it. Something happened where they were overbilling state residents, and they had to give money back to the state. So only when it was what I refer to as sort of like Christmas in July sort of situations where, you know, some vendor got caught, they had to return $900,000, and then of that, 60,000 was allocated to us. The state government took this 900, split it up. It was like this much for the libraries, this much for this group, this much for that group, and we got 60 grand. That's the only reason why, in the end, in that particular instance I'm thinking of, we were able to buy a couple of F5s, a couple of load balancers to deploy in the network, because that was the usual sort of scenario. There was nothing in the budget. People didn't, and sorry, I'm gonna not throw anyone under the bus, but as a general observation, too many environments are set up where they treat networking as a cost center. And I think that's a critical mistake, because you look at, for example, the world we live in today, how many of these places would survive without their network and without their computing, right? These are not optional. We are now to the point where having internet connectivity, having network connectivity is just as critical as electricity and water, but we don't have a mandate for that anywhere in the government. But we should, frankly, because you look at state government. I'll say it for here. I'm in a pretty high end area. The amount of stuff they put online, the expectation they have that the citizenry has access to the internet.
Yeah.
That's not fair to people that are disadvantaged, right? That creates the digital divide, right? Is the general term used for that. That digital divide hasn't disappeared. In some places, it's been exacerbated. And I am highly sensitive to that, having spent as many years, I mean, all told, probably 3 decades worth, in a place where I watched the impact that can have. And I mean, most states are like that. Even the ones that are better equipped with taxes and even where I am here, there's plenty they haven't done. There's plenty of folks in this state who are also at a disadvantage. And it's
I've been gratified to see the Rural Broadband Initiative in the U.S. Affect a lot of the communities near where I live, up here in northern New England. I'm up near the Canadian border. There's not a lot of infrastructure. But we've seen fiber rollouts happening in a bunch of little towns, and most of that's tied to that federal program where it's bringing. I have gig symmetrical to my house now. We had Spectrum; it was okay. Now I got gig fiber that they rolled out to the whole town, and there's neighboring communities where they've had similar projects and initiatives that have been driven by those grants to try to reduce the digital divide.
And this isn't the first time, right? I mean, the first time was during the American Recovery Act. You had 2 programs back then. I say this because the R&E network I worked for, we were heavily involved in some of this stuff in our state. You had the BOP, the BTOP, the broadband. Gosh, I always forget the acronyms. BTOP was one, the BTOP program under the Department of Commerce, I think it was. And then you had the BOP, the Broadband Opportunities Program. I might have those backwards. One of them was under the Rural Utility Service of the Department of Agriculture. Don't ask. But I remember specifically because on one occasion, my director was on vacation out of the country. My boss had surgery that he had to get done. And so they asked me if I would go down to the state capitol where the Secretary of State for the governor at the time, was trying to, as I later put it, trying to herd cats. They were trying to corral people because the BTOP and the BOP programs, anybody could apply for funding. And so you had mom and pops doing it. You had, county tax offices doing it. You had other different groups doing it. And they were trying to say, look, let's learn to play the game. We're a poor state. This is a federal funding project. There were 3 phases to it. And this was what they were really, I'm summing up what took an enormous amount of time to cover. But what they were basically trying to say is, look, this federal grant program has 3 phases to it. The first phase is due in 3 weeks. The next one is due 3-4 months later, and another 3-4 months after that. They said, look, we don't have a snowball's chance in heck of competing against states like California, who are going to bring all their resources to bear to file these applications. But if we can get our application in during this first phase, we have a shot at getting some money. And so that was basically the end goal, was trying to get everybody to work together. And amazingly, and I don't know whether I should say where I live, because this all ended up in the public news. So I'm not speaking out of turn, I don't think, at this point. But the state received the largest single BTOP grant in the country. So anybody wants to look that up, they can look that one up. It did, unfortunately, about a year later, I think it was about a year later, trigger something that popped up into the national news that was referred to as Routergate. Because, and the thing is, I know the context of this and most people don't. So when they saw the news, they're like, oh my gosh, all this wasteful spending of federal dollars in this state that bought all this Cisco gear, high-end Cisco gear. But I know the story behind that because I was in the meeting that they were having this conversation. They had 3 weeks to put in a federal grant proposal to answer, if anybody's ever done grant proposals, they can be quite complex. They can be quite detailed. It's a pain in the butt. I mean, you had to hit categories like unserved areas versus underserved areas. It's a complex sort of thing. And I don't begrudge grant writers. I mean, Paper Pushers Unite, you guys have a great one. It's not for me. I'll build the network, but you guys do the paperwork. But the truth was, they were like, to get this proposal in, they went to Cisco SEs and they were like, we need a box that we can deploy in different scenarios around the state to meet these, what they refer to as anchor institutions. So basically locations where you would anchor these broadband connections. And the end result was they basically spec'd out and they intentionally said, give us one model with a configuration that's adaptable. So it would work in different environments. So if you guys remember, there was the Cisco 3945 router that had a couple of slots in it. And so they spec'd out a box that was, memory serves, it was about 25 grand a piece. And they decided just, to treat them like chiclets. Let's get a whole ton of them, put in a proposal, ask for all these anchor institutions. When we get the boxes in, we deploy them. If one of them dies, we have spares. But instead of having 10 makes or 3 different makes and 5 different models to deal with, if you have all the same, kind of like you were talking about, Ethan, it's like, I got spares. Okay, what happened? That board inside died. Well, I got 10 more boxes. Let me pull one of the boards out. Boom, here you go. We're good to go. And so that was what the SE guy, I'm assuming, because this part I have to assume, but they came back with, well, this box will serve lots of needs. It'll serve high-end needs. It'll serve low-end needs. The end result, unfortunately, was that reporters came in like a year, 2 years later, and they would find, for example, a local library that had 2 PCs in it with, some, I don't know, 1 megabit connection or whatever, with a Cisco
for the 3945 hanging off
25 grand router sitting there in and like in one case, I think it was a 1-room building, 1-room house, so, and then of course, you get all the people who come out of context and they're like, oh my gosh, the wasteful spending. It's like, yeah, that could have been done with a Linksys. You're not wrong. I mean, from a technical perspective, absolutely correct. But I also knew the context of how they played the game. They filed the grant, they got it in on time. They beat a lot of other states who didn't apply until the 2nd or the 3rd phase. And they were successful in it. And it's like, that whole hate, don't hate the player, hate the game. They should have changed the way they did things. I mean, and it's unfortunate. There was definitely inefficiencies there. There were definitely, as a taxpayer, I didn't care for it because, it's still my tax dollars. But, when you don't have much, you will use whatever tactics you can, to try to get an edge, if you will. And it's all within bounds. It wasn't like they were stealing or doing anything illegal. It was completely within the rules. So,
Frank, talk to us about your favorite open source software. Open source is, for those of us on a budget, we love the open source world because we can do things for quote unquote free. I mean, not exactly, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. So I started taking notes on this and I had to stop because, in all honesty, my list is way too long. So, I mean, and I can do it from every level because I play in every sandbox, right? So I like operating systems, I like programming languages, I like databases. I play in all these different spaces. So obviously, even and I'll speak since we're in networking, and I'm lately for many years now, I've been involved in network automation work. I'll focus a little in that realm. Obviously, open source Linux comes to mind almost immediately because it's
Sure.
the foundation of an awful lot, right? I happen to be a Mac user. I like Macs because underneath is basically BSD Linux, BSD Unix, which is the same in the sense of for 99% of the stuff you do, what I can do on Linux, I can do on my Mac and vice versa. Um, all the programming languages I use are technically open source. Python, of course, being the big dog. Go is my preferred language if I can use it. But I can say PHP, Perl, Lua. Um, for anybody who does editing work, VS Code, of
Wait a
course.
minute, wait. Lua. What are you using Lua for?
So, ever use Wireshark?
Yeah.
So, what do you think dissectors are written in?
Oh,
Yeah,
huh. Did not know
yeah,
that.
not World of Warcraft. That's another place where Lua is used. So it's used to automate stuff. But I don't play World of Warcraft. So, but I happen to know that because when I studied Lua, Lua is actually interesting to me because it was developed down in Brazil. Um, and Lua is the Portuguese word for moon. So, uh, but yeah, that's Wireshark is one. So Nmap is another tool that uses Lua
Huh.
for some of the tools.
Hmm.
So yeah, getting more on the network side because I'm sitting here going through my list like, okay, databases. So obviously, okay, I'm on a Mac and I use Linux. My mantra is I use Macs because I want to, Linux because I like to, Windows because I have to. But I always tell people I'm OS agnostic. Whenever I look for solutions, I always gun for solutions that will work for whatever you prefer. I don't want anybody telling me I got to use a Windows machine any more than I want to tell somebody else they got to use a Mac or a Linux machine because use what works for you is my philosophy. So when I look for solutions, I try to find ones that'll work for everybody. So on the network side, obviously, for basic telnet SSH stuff, there's iTerm2 on the Mac. On the Windows side, everybody knows PuTTY. I've never
Mhm.
been a big PuTTY fan. I mean, I used it when it was first out and it was the only thing. I don't know why anybody
Yeah.
still uses it, if I'm being honest. If I was on Windows, the one tool I found that I thought was way better was an open source program called mRemoteNG, which
Hmm.
does Telnet, SSH, VNC, RDP. You can use one client to configure everything. And you can, like, I use a program on a Mac.
Okay, yeah.
I had to break down and buy a paid program to match that on the Mac side because I couldn't find an equivalent. iTerm2 is a wonderful program, but it doesn't have the same flexibility. So I use a program called Royal TSX. And actually, there's a version for Mac, there's a version for Windows, but this is a commercial product. So it doesn't fall under the open source side. But on the Windows side, if I was on Windows, it would definitely be on Remote NG because it has inheritance. You can set up a password one time and have it ripple through the whole thing. So if you're connecting to a bunch of switches and routers, you don't have to configure each one of them individually. Could be very handy for that. Um, Obviously, on the automation side, most people will know Ansible, which is written in Python. If you code in Python, there's NetMiko and Nornir, which are the two I tend to use the most. Some people use SaltStack, again, also written in Python. Um, from a monitoring perspective, there's LibreNMS. I really do like that.
I've spent a little time with that. Yeah.
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 So, and that one on the back end, I built one for my previous job, and it's still running. I actually realized it was still up at one point. I was like, I wonder if it's still running. It was like, yep, it's still there. Um, it uses, I want to say I had to install Redis, Postgres, or Maria, one of the two. And so when you get into the databases, I really like SQLite for a lot of my low end work because it's quick and easy. Postgres, of course, you have MySQL, MariaDB.
Well,
Recently,
SQLite, correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, but the big deal there is it's basically a text file and
no, no,
you're
no, it's
querying it.
it's definitely not a text file, but it is one file. So the key thing about SQLite is that unlike PostgreSQL, Maria's MySQL and MariaDB, to me they're one and the same because one's a fork of the other. Those are all multi-user databases, right? So they're relational
Yeah, I
databases.
think of they're SQL engines. Yeah.
Well, they're SQL engines in the sense that you can run multiple things against them simultaneously. So SQLite does not have that. There is no user. There is no there's no user concept. It's literally a single file database that almost every language, like Python, has SQLite support built into it. Go, there's a module for it. But the real powerful part is everything, all your tables, all your indexes, everything you have is stored in a single file. And that is incredibly powerful. The downside is if you write an application that is going to be accessed for write by lots of services, it's not the right tool to use, right? Because it's a single write sort of database. But if you're writing a Python script, if you're writing an application in Django that you're only running on a limited system, or you're doing mostly read operations, SQLite is fantastic. I use it in a lot of places where I don't want to deal with having to do the database maintenance, because all you got to do is back up to one file and you're good to go.
Have you played around with open source network OSs, Cumulus, and so on? Has that been relevant to your environments?
I have wanted to. Unfortunately, where I was, we were a Cisco shop. Where I am now, we are, and it's not the right term for it, but we're an extreme shop. By that, I really mean, for those who don't know, there used to be a company called Cabletron that spun out its hardware division as a company called Enterasys.
Yeah.
Eventually, Enterasys got bought by Extreme Networks. So in that context, where I work now is an extreme shop, but it's technically a Cabletron shop that just kind of rolled into this over time.
You're telling me that the lineage of Cabletron and Enterasys operating systems lives on today?
It does, unfortunately.
I had no idea that
we
that had survived. Wow, that's
so-
a long time ago.
So where I am, we have about 3,000 switches across our campus. We have 300 buildings, I think. I forget the numbers. I mean, I'm not one to memorize this stuff. We have like 11,000 access points. So we use Aruba for the access points currently. But on the switch side, it's Extreme. But by saying Extreme, I always cringe, because like if you say Cisco, you know it's pretty much iOS. And if it's not iOS, it's Nexus. Or of course, now you have iOS XE and iOS XR. But Cisco is Cisco for the most part. I mean, I know I'm oversimplifying, and the Cisco people don't freak out on me. But for the most part, you know what you're getting. If you say you're a Juniper shop, you're mostly dealing with Junos, and you know what you're getting. When you say you're an Extreme shop, you have to really clarify. So we still have gear running Enterasys's NOS, which is called EOS, Enterasys OS, not to be confused with Arista's EOS,
Right.
which we also run because we have Arista switches in our research computing center.
Does Extreme also have a VIA in their portfolio?
They do. And so here is, and I'm sorry, and if there's anybody from Extreme on, don't take this the wrong way. I do this to wrap this around other people's heads. So Extreme, their business model is they had their own gear. So their own switches run an operating system called EXOS, EXOS, so Extreme's operating system. But as a company, in order to grow, I always sum it up this way, and I know it sounds kind of harsh, and it's not intended to. It's just to simplify things. They hoovered up all the failed companies in order to grab their Rolodexes, in order to expand their market share, and they've done a good job with that. I mean, let's be honest, they've done a really good job with that. So they bought some of the failed parts of Brocade, including SLX OS, which we run in our data center, because Extreme did not have any deep packet buffer switches in their own lineup. They bought parts of Avaya, which includes VOS, which we are currently looking at running because we are looking at replacing our current setup using SPB, shortest path bridging. And they have, let me think, we said EOS, EXOS, VOS. They've also
got a couple of WLAN OSs.
They also bought, well, they had their own wireless, and then they went and bought Aerohive, which was, as I put it, the last man standing after all the meshy cloud wireless providers got bought up, right? Because it was, everybody thought that Aerohive might go to one of the big players, and then suddenly Juniper bought Mist, and everybody went, oh, and the only one left was Aerohive. And I know Aerohive because we used them at my previous job. In fact, I evaluated both Aerohive and Meraki before either one of them got swooped up. So Meraki was just getting ready to go public, and then Cisco did their classic case of swoop in, offer whatever amount, 100 million something, and they took them right off the table before they even had a shot at an IPO. But by then I had already chosen Aerohive over Meraki for very specific reasons. So, and this is the other side of my life, is where I was. Since we had no money, we obviously didn't have the staff we needed, which meant I had to wear all the hats. So, you know, you end up being like, I used to go to conferences and they would sit there and say, so who's your security guy? And I would be like, wow, that's a really good idea. you know, and they had this look of horror on their face. And I'm like, you know, we don't have a security group. It just doesn't exist. It's like, it's kind of on us to figure it out. And then they'd be like, well, who does your voice? And I'd raise my hand. It's like, who does your Wi-Fi? I was like, can I just leave my hand up? Because odds are I'm playing with it in one form or another. It's just, you know, and it's not that I worked in a group of 5, 6 of us, but I got to play in a lot of sandboxes. So, you know, when the F5s were purchased, thanks to one of those Christmas in July situations, my boss came to me and was like, okay, we got this money. We bought these F5s. Go figure it out. So other than actually choosing we're going to buy F5s, which was not my choice, from the moment the boxes arrived, it was me. I unboxed them, I racked them, I stacked them, I wired them, I configured them, and then I broke out the manuals and figured out how the heck they worked. And that was kind of the dance. And that's another thing that's sort of my career path is I like that sort of thing. Like throw me at a project, I figure it out, I solve it. Once it's in place and all we're doing is maintenance grind, let me train somebody up to do that so that I can go be useful somewhere else, because that sort of, some people want that, right? Some people have that career path of, I want to be, you know, I worked for a consulting company back in the 90s, and there was a coworker I had. He was the exchange guy. So his whole job was supporting Microsoft Exchange for our customers. So I was talking to him at one point about something Windows related, and he had this deer in the headlights look. And I was like, how do you not know this? Aren't you an Exchange guy? Don't you know the operating system on which your software depends? But they didn't. His expertise was literally Exchange. And I can't relate to that. I'm the jack of all trades. I play in a lot of different spaces, and I'm also the kind, I don't want to just use a tool. I want to know the tool, and that's because eventually, you know, we're talking about open source here. A lot of times, the support for that is you. And
well, that's a question I wanted to ask, because it's the sort of remark there's a general remark of, well, I can't afford commercial, so go open source. But there are costs associated with open source, even though it's free, like your time, finding the right drivers, what hardware will it run on? Does it have the features I need? So how do you balance that? Yeah, I can use this free software, but there's also costs associated with it.
so there we get into again, and this is I think I told you guys the story already. I am from my background watching my father growing up, and then when I took the job at this R&E network, one of the reasons I took the job was the guy I interviewed with, my boss, was one of those really rare types. He was smarter than me, which I really love because I wanted to learn, and he was capable of seeing the numbers behind numbers. So I'll tell the story again for the audience, I guess, so they have some sense for it. So when I got hired for this R&E network, they had just gone from on-premise modems. This is dial-up era. This is pre-broadband. They had just gone from having on-premise equipment, which was the U.S. Robotics Courier chassis, to farming it out to Verizon, who had Cisco, I want to say 5300s. I forget the models. We were talking about this the other day, Ethan. But they were using a set of modems that only did K56 Flex. And there were 2 standards for dial-up in those days. There was K56 Flex and V.92. And the US Robotics could do everything. And I remember in the interview process, when he was talking about those boxes, he's like, well, I chose those boxes not because they were cheap. They were actually more expensive. I could have bought the
Cisco
Ciscos.
boxes he chose?
No, the Ciscos were cheaper. The Ciscos were
Okay.
significantly cheaper.
These would have been the AS5301s then that we were
Yeah.
talking about the other day. Yeah.
This is also back in the time when Windows computers very often came with those crappy little Win modems, which weren't really modems at all. They were those soft modems. So anybody who was like me, who had a clue, you bought a US Robotics. You got something that could do proper V.92 standard, right? The ITU standard, but ideally you got one that could talk to anything. And so what impressed me was, one, he bought a piece of equipment that would support any user, because you didn't want to have people calling up saying, well, I can't connect to your dial-up because I have product X. It was like, the product we have talks to everything. So that was one, was he could see far enough ahead to go, I don't want to deal with the headaches of support, right? But of basic dial-up support. More importantly, though, even though the boxes were more expensive up front, he was like, the one thing I know is I can remotely update the firmware in these. Whereas the Ciscos, you couldn't. I think that was one of the issues at the time. And so 6 months later, he goes, and 6 months later, we had to actually do a firmware update on these modem chassis, which were deployed around the state I lived in, which, depending from where I lived, to get the furthest corner could easily take you 3.5, 4 hours, depending. So we had modems in 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 locations. So we're talking a truck roll just to do firmware updates on this equipment would have cost us a couple of days worth of manpower. He could do it all across the network. In that one moment, he saved all the money that was the price difference and then some. From that point, it was pure profit and, pure gain. And it was that kind of thing that, so when you look at open source, and the reason I tell this story is when you look at open source, yeah, people say, oh, it's free. But no, it's not free. You're going to have to sit down and figure it out. You're going to have to more than likely support it, or you're going to have to go talk to the community that supports it. So if you're not somebody like me, if you're not a technical person, right? If you just think, oh, I'm doing it because it's cheap, you're in for a rude awakening, especially the more complex the software is, right? Depending on what it is you want to build. Some of this stuff is easy. It's drop in and go. Some of the open source folks are fantastic. They build you software that is as easy to use as anything out there, if not easier. But the more complicated systems like LibreNMS, let's use a simple one, right? For monitoring your network. You say, I can't afford, I don't know, What's Up Gold or SolarWinds or any of these products. Oh, I'm gonna deploy LibreNMS. Well, I can tell you this because I've done it. Hope you know Linux and hope you're comfortable there, that you understand how to stand up a web server. In my case, I used Nginx. Other people use Apache. You better know some PHP. You better understand how to set up the database. If you want it to perform reasonably well, you're going to have to get a Redis instance going. And then once it's up and running, you also need to understand its limitations. So like for me, LibreNMS in the days when I used it, I think I used a 4-core system with 8 or 16 gig of RAM. It wasn't even all that bad. We used it to monitor the entire state network, but it was a small state network, right? Where I used to work, we had 55 counties, 2 routers in each county at least. So it's 110 devices right there. We had other equipment, switches in the 2 data centers. We operated the 2 POPs and other gear. All told, I want to say we were running 350. We were monitoring about 350 devices. Now, in some cases, you're talking a switch with 48 ports. And in some cases, you're talking like a Cisco 7600, where you might have several blades with 48 ports each in them. So, it's a lot of tracking that you're doing. LibreNMS can handle probably, I on average in my head, I estimate 300 to 500 devices, at which point it taps out. And at that point, you're going to have to stand up another one. Now, if you've ever done network monitoring, if you've ever used commercial tools, this might start sounding familiar, because if you run a large environment like where I am now, we have 3,000 switches. I would never recommend LibreNMS in this environment. I mean, unless we absolutely had no money and we had to make it work. But even the commercial products, and we've used products like Intuity, there was CA Spectrum, there's other ones. Almost none of them scale to the size of the network we have individually. So that means you're standing up multiple nodes to probe parts of the network. Now you're going to have to configure and figure out what part of the network each one of these is going to babysit. And even if it's software that's well designed and has what I call the MOM, the manager of managers, which is usually the quote unquote single pane of glass, where in my book, pane is often spelled PAIN. But the idea that, okay, we have this central thing that shows us our whole network, but what you really have is half a dozen probing systems that are probing segments of your network and then aggregating that up. That's a pretty complex system too. Now you might pay a company 6-7 figures for that software. But this is where you get into a dance. It's like, no matter what, whether you're using open source or using commercial, this is the structure you're probably looking at, unless you find that golden thing. So for example, the one software I found to do what LibreNMS does, a monitoring program that tracks and graphs your ports and things like that, is a product called AKIPS. And for those who remember StatSeeker, these are the only 2 programs. They were written by the same guy. That's the amazing part. It's the only 2 programs that will scale to the size of the network like what we have. We are running AKIPS in my environment where we are, and we track everything. It is fantastic. It is an amazing product. Is it pretty? No, it's not the prettiest, but it does what we need it to do. But you have to know what you're doing either way, right? Whether you're using commercial software or whether you're going to do it open source. And that's where you need to sit down and figure it out. So the open source or the commercial product like AKIPS, you got a company. You can pay them money. You can pay them support. You can bring somebody in to consult if you're in an environment where you don't have time for that. If you're in an environment where you can afford to do it, and I would even tell you in this case, I'd still go with AKIPS because I think it's a far better value. I wouldn't want to stand up 6 LibreNMS nodes and try to figure out some way to aggregate that data. That's a lot of work, and it doesn't make sense. It's not fiscally smart. And that's where you have to sit down and trade the cost off. But you have to be able to look at it and see, like, as I say, the numbers behind the numbers. Yes, the software was free, but how many man hours did it take to not just stand it up, but now you need to start thinking, okay, well, every month or every week or however often, oh, there's updates to Linux, there's updates to the software that's part of that stack. How many boxes did you have? Oh, okay, we got to patch those. Who's going to do that? Who's going to be responsible for that? Who has the expertise for that? Um, it's the ability to see the whole thing, to step back, look from 30,000 feet. There are cases where I would flat out tell you, yes, use open source, because in some cases it's absolutely not worth it to buy the commercial product. I've actually, from a support perspective, I would honestly tell people in many areas, I would far rather use open source. I've had cases where a problem that occurred with an open source product. Let me use databases as an example. PostgreSQL. You have an issue with PostgreSQL, you go online, you go into the forum or the email mailing list, whatever. It's been so long since I've had an issue that I haven't had to deal with this. But I'm old enough that I actually remember having to compile Postgres for Windows under one of the virtualizations, Ming W32. Um, and but if I ask them a question, I have answers within the same day, very often within the same hour. And commercial vendors, no offense, but I mean, I can tell horror stories that I'm sure everyone can relate to, whether it's Cisco TAC, Juniper TAC, JTAC, doesn't matter. There's cases where you're like, oh my gosh, I spent 3 days and I got through 3 tiers of people and not a single one of them. I can give one from my current job where we had an issue with the VPN that lasted for almost a year. And in the end, the solution was not presented by the vendor. It was actually me going on a Slack, not packet pushers in this particular instance, but the community, one of the other communities I'm heavily involved with, Internet 2, actually. I had an answer in 15 minutes. And this is where it's like knowing your tribe or knowing where to go. And in the open source world, everyone understands, well, okay, not everyone. There's always the ones who are like, why isn't this working? And they're acting like they paid for it. But the vast majority of folks that use open source know that it's a community. And so they're either, at the beginning, like, when you first learn something, you're like, I have no idea how any of this crap works. Hey, can somebody help me? And then eventually you learn a little bit more. And then you get to a point where you see somebody else who's where you were 6 months ago. And you're like, well, here, I can help you with that. And then, it bubbles up higher. It's the same as what we do here in packet pushers at times.
Yep.
And that part of it, very often you will see and come to realize that in certain cases, why am I paying, obscene amounts of money to a vendor when I could do it with open source, get support from a community and do it cheaper? But it does require doing the math. I mean, you do have to, there are definitely cases, and I can't say like you have to do it here and not do it there. I mean, you have to sit down and figure it out. And your environment could be different than mine. There could be, you have more staff or you're in an environment with a lot of cheap intern labor. It just depends in certain cases. But they're definitely, for me, it's the total cost of ownership. We throw out all these acronyms and we use them real quick, but it really does require sitting down and going, okay, what is the actual cost here? And figuring out man hours, figuring out, okay, well, if I pay this cloud provider, you can easily go to AWS and spin up an instance. That's easy. A lot of people are complaining and saying, well, I'm just going to run it myself. Are you willing to do it? Do you have the manpower to do it? Do you have the equipment to do it? What happens when the power goes out? Do you have the connectivity? Do you have the redundancy? Do you do the backups? I mean, make sure you understand exactly what it is that you're paying for and not paying for, because there's certain things that you get, with AWS, there's a lot of stuff that's built in that you have to then do yourself. And in some cases, it's worth the trade-off. In other cases, not so much.
So this takes me to the last thing I wanted to ask you about, Frank, that was really grabbed my attention during our planning call, which is CapEx versus OpEx. That is, it's easy to make a decision sometimes to buy something because it's cheaper up front, but then owning it over the long haul is actually more expensive. And you'd think that it'd be an easy equation to come up with, but in your experience, you're seeing people who don't seem to make that TCO, total cost of ownership calculation, and they'll make a mistake because OpEx will be really too expensive and they didn't think about it.
Yeah. So I don't know. Are you looking for an example or what's
Well,
the question?
so the question is you've run into this, and where have you seen issues where people have made that decision, make the wrong trade-off? They'll save a few bucks up front, but then I'm spending more in the long run.
Oh gosh. Let's see, that one I have to think about. Now, I can give an example, but unfortunately, it's not in networking. So, and you sit there and you go, come on, the math on this is not hard. This is when you see a lot of people that'll make a decision purely like, well, no, we can't afford that because they're only thinking about what's right in front of them, but they're not anticipating potential future. So, I told this story recently, right? My father back in the early 90s, I want to say, fax machines had come out. They'd become a thing. And at that point in time in the shipping industry, ships, when they travel across the ocean, the only form of communication they had was either radio ship to shore, which meant you had to be within, I forget if it's 50 miles, 100 miles of shore. If once you're in the middle of the Atlantic, you can't communicate by radio.
Yeah.
The other option was satellite radio or satellite phones, but they were crazy expensive. So making
Yeah.
a phone call and talking on a satellite phone from a ship to shore, that was expensive stuff. So my dad sat there and figured out, well, even though and I'm sorry, I'm going to throw out non-techie terms here because if I start saying charter hire and stuff like that, people won't really understand. But in the shipping industry, very often when you're an operations company and you're moving cargo from A to B, you don't own the ships. So you're operationally just managing them. You rent the ships. This is referred to as charter hire. So charter hire on ships back in those days, I don't want to think about what it costs now. But back in those days, could easily be $3,000 to $5,000 a day.
Wow.
And so his point to his leadership was, look, let's buy fax machines and have them installed on each of these ships. And here's what we get for that. We put a fax machine on these ships. If they're in the middle of the ocean, we can send them a fax. 1 minute satellite phone call. We can transmit a page worth of information. So this can be very handy. And the example he was giving was the number of times that they would have, they've got cargo on the East Coast of the United States and it's heading to Europe. And then the ship's halfway across the ocean and they realize, crap, we got to turn that ship around because we need it to stop at another port. Well, too late. You're going to have to wait till it gets within range of shore in Europe, right? You're losing a day or two of shipping time. That's 5-10 grand easy of charter hire. And he's like, but if we put a fax machine on board, we can transmit in 1 minute all this information that we need. We can shorten the cycle basically. And he was thinking ahead, which I thought was really brilliant. But the leadership took the cheap approach, which was, it's not our ship. So, why would we spend 5,000 to put this thing on there? And he's like, one time, you use it one time over the course of our charter hire, which typically was multi-year long. You're going to save, if you save 1 day of shipping, you've got your money back. It was not a hard equation to do the math on. And yeah, you could have a few ships that you would install it on and never need it. But the statistical odds were so far in your favor that you'd be foolish not to. But they chose the cheap approach, which was don't do anything. And, I know there were cases where ships were out of pocket for way longer than they should have been. It was like, wow, Dad, that one trip, they could have paid for all of them. It's like it would have been done. But that is typically what you see more often is that people won't spend. It's not, okay, we're taking the cheaper approach. They take the sort of no approach. I mean,
Yeah.
Have you had to have
Yeah.
that conversation with people, and have you found ways to get them to see, like, yeah, I get there's an upfront cost here, but on the back end, look how we might save or actually get the money back, et cetera. Have you found ways to be successful having that conversation?
have I had the conversation? Yes. Have I been successful in the conversation? I'm trying to remember because we're talking a long career here, but like I said, most of my career path was I had to figure out ways to just do it, free, where money wasn't a part of the equation.
Okay.
But it is I know it's a tough thing, especially depending on the environment. If you're in a poor environment, it's tougher to get people to spend money. Like I was like the example I gave of my late boss, I was impressed that he was able to do what he did. Now I don't know whether he needed to go outside of himself to, he was the head of the networking group, so he could probably make that determination on what equipment to buy. But there were definitely plenty of times where we would go. We tried. Yeah, I can give some examples, and I'll just one that comes to mind. We had a director. I loved him. He's a fantastic man. and he was trying to do something really brilliant for the state. He actually couldn't get where we were was one of the few states in the country that doesn't have decent long haul fiber of a capacity that you would have in most states. And we were trying to diversify, and we were trying to find a way to leverage that. So he ended up doing a capital expenditure project in the state capital where we ran fiber across the town because he did the math on it, and it was like, this is, instead of renting the fiber, right? Instead of getting lease on lit fiber or even dark fiber, we decided to actually run our own fiber from the Capitol complex to the nearest POP for the provider. And then we had, I think it was 128 strands off of it, and we ran some to a couple of agencies. And the end goal was, if we could partner with one of the few carriers that did have a divergent path out of the state, we'd be like, okay, well, you get some of our fiber and we get some of your fiber. So they would have more aggregate capacity going into the state capital complex for state agencies, and we would get capacity out of the state, which is what we were looking for as a REN, as a research and education network. And it was a fantastic project. It was well thought out. Unfortunately, political winds shifted, certain other things changed. That's too long of a story to tell. And the people that ended up running the place didn't understand the value that was sitting right in front of them. They sold it off, wasted all the opportunities. And actually, that is part of, but not the main reason, but that is part of the reason I ended up leaving. It's all in that same sort of mindset of not being able to see, not the expression is, you got to be able to see past the end of the nose on your face, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, unfortunately, you see that more often than not. Folks not making smart decisions. They're not thinking. They're not thinking
Yeah.
long term. They're not using the right metric, in my opinion. So
Yeah, and in tech, especially networking, you got to have that long-term thinking, especially when you're doing like a hardware purchase. That those F5s you bought and Cisco gear and whatever all the rest of it is, it's going to be in there 5 years, 7 years, potentially, all depending on what it is, of course.
and
And the
if you're an ISP, you're
salesperson
thinking
who's
10,
got
20
a
years.
number to meet, that salesperson who's got a number to meet, they'll cut you a deal on the front end, knowing you're going to be spending for SmartNet on the back end. And once you've got it, you got to have that SmartNet or whatever the other contract is to support that thing. As a consultant, it's support and service. That's where the money's made. It's not on the hardware up front. So you can feel like you're getting this great deal on whatever the thing is that you're buying, and the money's getting made on the back end. And you've got to understand that's you got to pay. Money's coming out of your pocket one way or the other, and you really got to think about a multi-year engagement with the lifetime service of that device to understand whether it's what you're really paying for and how you're paying for it. And it's still, depending on corporate budgets and so on, yeah, maybe it does make sense to do something that in the long run doesn't seem like the numbers should have worked out that way, but they do because accountants do what they do. But there's other short-sighted things like we're going to buy the thing, but you're going to train your staff on how to use the thing. Oh gosh, no, that'd be, why would we do that? That'd be very expensive. So that's a short-sighted thing where it gets harder to quantify with accounting, because all I show is that I didn't spend X thousands of dollars on training for the team. But now they don't know how to use it, and there's outages and there's other things that are difficult to quantify, but actually do impact the bottom line of the company because of those short-sighted decisions. I see stuff like that happen. It's normal. It's like the way of things. It's rare when you're like, oh yeah, and of course we're going to train the team and we're going all in on this thing and we're going to be efficient and we're making a big commitment. And no, not usually, not usually, Frank.
Now that you say that, and I just had this conversation with my wife actually here in the past week, because I mean, you see this concept of, and this is everywhere. This is not a judgment on a specific industry. People are very often willing to buy stuff, like you say, but that's where they stop. So
Yeah.
I'll use an example that I can tell. So for my previous job, at one point, and this is another common thing you'll see is, vendors these days, they're getting smarter, that they would show up and be like, hey, there's this federal grant out here that will let you buy, and I'll use this as an example, that will let you buy these video conferencing units, super expensive. By the way, we make those. And it's like, yeah, but we don't have a grant writer or anything. No worries, no worries. We've got somebody who can help you write the grant. So you got vendors coming into places like where I used to live, where they're like, we're going to help you write the grant so that you can go ask for the money from the federal government so that you can then buy our stuff. And that's, I mean, I fault the vendors for that one a little bit, but at the same time, everybody's playing their games. But the bigger problem was in this particular instance I'm thinking of, we got this grant money. A bunch of these video conferencing units were bought. These were high-end Cisco. I'm trying to remember MX80, MX100. I forget the model number, but these were. And the weird part is the thing I do remember is they were manufactured in Poland of all places. But these units came in. They were distributed across the state to different places, different institutions, and that was pretty much the end of it. As part of this whole thing, they never considered, hey, how about if you're going to put it in, I don't know, a university or K-12 school or wherever they were placed, how about training up the people there so they actually know how to use it? And so that it can actually be, because buying a smart board for a classroom or buying iPads or Chromebooks for your students, that's fine. But if you never teach the teachers how to use the tech to help the kids, I mean, a tool is, a hammer is useless unless you know how to swing it. And the same goes for any high-tech tool. The more dangerous part is it's an awful lot of money going to waste. And I use the example I am using because in the particular instance I'm referring to, I forget how much money was spent. It was well into six figures. And these units were deployed. And the thing that sticks in my mind more than anything was, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years later, we got a phone call from one of these places. And they called up and they said, could you come pick up this thing? Nobody uses it. So all that money, and I'm not talking a $300 Chromebook. I'm talking, probably a $10,000 video conferencing unit, 15,000. I forget what they cost. I mean, but we're talking significant money. This unit sat wherever it was and was never utilized because they didn't do, they didn't bring in the training. They did. It's like, good heavens, come on. I mean, if you're going to spend the money, spend that little extra bit. And you could, it's that sort of order of magnitude, that sort of, 10 times power. The device is one thing, but without the training, but with the training, holy cow, suddenly, it's not worth that much. It's worth 10 times that much because suddenly everybody sees the value in it. But instead, what you get is all that money went to waste. So taxpayer money was wasted. Our time was wasted. I mean, the only one that walked away from it, of course, is the vendor who sold some stuff. But it doesn't benefit anybody. It's like they could have done better. The vendor could have done better because if everybody had seen the value in their product, more of them would have been bought. So it's short-sightedness by so many on different levels. And it's unfortunate because, yeah, I mean, we can all look around and probably see examples of this. So I wish my experience was unique, but I know that when I say this, I can probably hear people going, crap.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Frank, how do people find you on the internet? You social out there?
I don't have the mental capacity or the time most of the time, but yes, I am out there. I'm easy to find. My name, as I say, Frank Seesink. As I usually say when I go into hotels, it's like walking in a bathroom. You see a sink, and usually when I tell people that, they laugh. But the funny part is they actually know how to spell my name. If you find my name, it's going to be me. I believe we're the only Seesinks in the country. And I'm on LinkedIn, Blue Sky. Don't waste your time. I am on Twitter, but I don't use it, so don't bother there. And I recently set myself up on Nostr, though that's a whole other story in itself. Okay. And I have a blog site, which is, again, my name. It's frank.seesink.com.
Okay, well, Frank, from us at Packet Pushers, thanks so much for your contributions to the Slack community, where you can be found as well. Folks, if you've not been in the Slack community at Packet Pushers, you can go to packetpushers.net/community. You can join for free, and there's just a few rules we want you to read before you jump in there. And Frank's an active participant, and someone will ask a question and Frank will do a brain dump that is like thoughtful and long and really helpful. Frank's a great contributor, and if we're all like Frank, we wouldn't have enough time to read it all. I'll put it that way. Thanks again, Frank, for all your contributions to the Packet Pushers community and for your thoughts today. And thanks to you out there for listening to Heavy Networking. If you have your own favorite strategies for squeezing the most out of your networking budget, would you let us know via packetpushers.net/follow-up? I'd appreciate reading those. And a quick reminder that we have a merch store now, store.packetpushers.net. The store ships worldwide, and we've been getting positive feedback on the quality of what folks have been getting. Most of you seem pretty happy. My heavy networking hoodie, by the way, that's a personal favorite. I wear it all the time here in the frozen northeast of the U.S. It's comfortable, it's warm, it's well made. So we're pretty happy with the merch store provider that we've settled on. So for everything we offer here at Packet Pushers, including a dozen different podcasts, you can visit packetpushers.net. It is all free for you. No login required. Just click and consume. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.